Welcome to the podcast, Flood Justice in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands. I'm your host, Lucas Belury. Flood Justice in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, or Flood Justice en las Fronteras for short, is a bilingual Spanish-English podcast that focuses on the problems of flood injustice along the U.S.-Mexico border. This project was funded by the Mellon Digital Humanities Grant and the Tinker Research Grant. Technical support has been provided by the Journal of the Southwest Radio. In our first episode, I interviewed Dr. Adriana Zuniga-Terran at the University of Arizona about the flooding in ambos Nogales, the twin border cities of Sonora, Arizona. In the next episode, I spoke with Dr. Javier Olivares Gonzalez at El Colegio de Frontera Norte in Matamoros. We discussed flooding in the Matamoros-Brownsville region at the very southern tip of the Texas-Mexico border. Today, I will be interviewing Dr. Caroline Tracey, a journalist who works in the southwestern United States, the U.S.-Mexico border region, and Mexico. Caroline and I will be discussing the history and contemporary politics of the Falcon Dam, a binational project located on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo River, and about halfway between Brownsville, Matamoros, and Laredo, Nuevo Laredo. Caroline, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin by situating ourselves. You and I are currently in Mexico City, but if you could, help us teleport ourselves and our listeners to the U.S.-Mexico border, to the location of today's podcast, the Falcon Dam. Could you tell us a little bit about this region of the Texas-Mexico border?
Absolutely. This is a region of Texas that, as you've said, is along the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo. And I guess to start situating ourselves, the first thing to do is just picture going southward. This is pretty far south in the continental United States, almost to the very southern tip, but not quite. It's still about 3 hours drive from McAllen and Brownsville in the Rio Grande Valley. And in terms of vegetation, what you want to picture is thorn scrub. So pretty green, pretty verdant, mesquite trees, but also all kinds of other shrub. And that has made it a very famously biodiverse region, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Before European settlement of the United States, this region was inhabited by a large number of different indigenous tribes that were separate cultural groups. So they spoke different languages, they had different customs. They considered themselves to be separate groups. Over time, anthropologists kind of grouped them together as the Cualitecan tribes. And this is not my area of expertise, but there's an excellent book called Peace Came in the Form of a Woman by Juliana Barr, if anyone is interested in kind of the Spanish, Indigenous, and French relationships in this moment in Texas. But in summary, as with elsewhere in the Americas, when you had the moment of contact with Europeans, there was definitely a big influence of disease. And then also you had the Spanish civilizing mission. And the way that played out in this region was the establishment of missions and an effort to kind of conscript indigenous people to sort of sedentarize, to be part of this, to be educated, to become civilized in the Spanish conception of it. And what effectively ended up happening was that the Cualitecan tribes actually kind of incorporated the Spanish missions into their existing pastoral routes. So they would move around during different parts of the year, and then the Spanish missions would be one of the places they would stop. At times also, the Spanish and the Texas tribes became kind of allies against the Apaches. And over time, what you have happen, as you have elsewhere in the Spanish Empire, is you have a lot of intermarriage. So you have nowadays people who live in this region generally are descendants of both indigenous and Spanish cultures. And in terms of the Falcon Dam in particular, the reason it's called the Falcon Dam is because it was located on the town of Falcón. It's not named after the bird, it's named after a Spanish surname. And that particular town was given by the Spanish king as what was called a porción to a settler named Jose Cristobal Ramirez. And he eventually gave it to inherited to his son, who married a woman named Maria Garza Falcón. She was the daughter of the founder of Matamoros, actually, and the town sort of grew up around their rancho. So in a nutshell, that's the history.
No, thank you for detailing that. It's such a rich and complex history. Dating back for hundreds and hundreds of years, and of course, obviously before contact.
And a funny Mexico City connection to, we're doing this interview in Mexico City and in the neighborhood called La Escandon. And this neighborhood is actually named for the person that the Spanish sent to explore this northern region of Texas. So the way that the Spanish got to know this region where the Falcon Dam is now was because they sent Escandon, the Escandon expedition. And so that's a funny connection between this interview and where we're sitting right now.
No, that's great. Thank you for sharing and detailing that. No, it is a really interesting connection. We happen to be in the neighborhood of Escandon in Mexico City. No, thank you so much for sharing that and for detailing that really rich and complex history. Moving forward quite a bit, I want to focus in particular now on sort of the contemporary or maybe the history of the last century. I know that last year there was a binational celebration of the dam's 70th anniversary, and I saw photos and videos of brass bands and soldiers from both Mexico and the U.S. sort of coming to sort of celebrate this dam, and the history of the dam, which finished construction in 1953, goes even longer than that. So, could you share a little bit about the binational politics, in the decades before the dam that led to the construction of the dam?
Definitely. In the decades leading up to the dam, for me, the very most important thing that happens is in 1904, a railway gets constructed leading all the way to Brownsville. So in the past, or before this time, most people from the continental United States, like Anglo settlers, have not gone this far into South Texas. They've had no interest in it, but now the railroads are expanding even further than they already had, and people start to arrive to want to farm, that they have this cheap and available farmland, and they want to settle it, and they want to grow citrus and other things with easily accessible irrigation water from the Rio Grande. Concurrently, Mexico is also setting up its own irrigation systems and irrigation districts. It's in a different mode. It's post-revolutionary, or rather, 1904 is not post-revolutionary, but by the time these systems get fully developed, it's after the Mexican Revolution, which ends in 1920. And so it's more of kind of a socialist endeavor of trying to give peasants small plots of land that have irrigation. But on both sides of the border, in these decades of the early 20th century, you're seeing a lot of expansion of irrigation in areas that historically were more like small ranches or some kind of like flood-based farming along the sides of the river. People often point to floods as a justification for the construction of these dams, that they are necessary to control the waters of the Rio Grande. That was not something that I came across in my research and my interviews. If someone is listening and that was their family's experience, I would love to hear about it. But really what I heard from people who lived in this region was that they knew pretty well, what was the flood season of the Rio Grande. They planted their crops accordingly. They didn't live that close to the river. They had a pretty good sense of what the river did, as sort of, unruly as the river was. But, and I think that that's also, Lucas, we've been to the Flood Justice and the Borderlands conference together and talked at length about the Rio Grande Valley. And my understanding from talking with you is that the flooding is more pluvial, right? It's more from rain and lack of drainage than it is from the river.
Absolutely.
Overflowing.
Absolutely.
So that was one thing that I really kind of felt like was important in my research, was that this flood justification really didn't hold up for me. It really seems to me that it was more about, you have a massive expansion of irrigation and you need water storage to make sure that you have enough irrigation water for those farms on both sides of the border. Then, as this irrigation expands, the two countries start to talk to each other because they realize that water storage is a necessity. And in 1944, they sign a treaty that governs not only the Rio Grande, but also the Tijuana River and the Colorado River. Obviously, this is a key document for today when we're seeing a lot of conflict over these transborder rivers and a lot of water crisis. But one of the clauses of that treaty was the agreement that they would build two dams on the Rio Grande, or at least two dams on the Rio Grande. And the first one they would build would be the downriver one. So starting after that treaty, they send parties to kind of examine possible locations for the dam, and they consider three, and they settle on the intermediary location, which is the town of Falcon. So that's sort of the nutshell political history of how the dam came to be.
No, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And so I think what you just said really leads us into my next question so beautifully, which is that sort of this theme that I've seen throughout this podcast series around sort of binational cooperation in the context of Ambos Nogales, in the context of Brownsville Matamoros, both cooperation and tension. And I think you really illustrated that well. And I think that is definitely alive and well in this project as well. Of course, as you just said, it was a binational project. There's even video of the U.S. and Mexican presidents at the time meeting and sort of celebrating the construction of the dam. I'm just wondering, could you share a little bit more about how transborder collaboration kind of came to be in the building of this project, and highlight sort of some of the nuances there for us?
Definitely. This was absolutely a binational project. It was, in fact, the first major dam that was constructed on an international border. The U.S. and Mexico split the cost. It was about $80 million. They also, interestingly, divided the labor and the construction. So you had kind of one Texas company winning the bid for the Texas side of the construction and another Mexican company winning the Mexican side. The laborers worked separately, with the exception of the carpenters who were building the wooden forms that they would use to create the concrete shapes. Those, in that case, the Mexican workers came to the US side, they built the forms side by side, and then they went back to their side. But in general, it was this project that was built in two identical halves, kind of amazingly. And also, interestingly, the construction site itself was like a free trip, what we would now call like a duty-free zone, I guess. You had to, in fact, go through customs to enter the construction site because it was this binational zone. So the construction itself was quite interesting. And then there also was, as you say, there was a ceremony where both the country's presidents came. They did kind of a handshake with like beauty queens from Texas and Tamaulipas on either side. And then they went to the Mexican side to do kind of the rest of the ceremony, where they had flown in a 30-piece orchestra from Mexico City. They had flown in dancers. They actually, sadly, a plane full of reporters crashed and they all died. But interestingly, the ceremony was really held on the Mexican side, and that, I'll mention this a little bit later, but they really, the Mexican side had invested a lot more in rebuilding the towns that were inundated by the construction of the flood. And so they had actually a newly built place to host this kind of ceremony, and the US side did not. So I think that's why that was the case. But in terms of ongoing collaboration, the agency that was responsible for the construction of the dam is an agency called the International Boundary and Water Commission. It's a fascinating agency that many Americans who don't live in the borderlands have not heard of. But they are basically tasked with both overseeing the border line in the kind of arid region of the border where there's no river dividing the countries, and overseeing the waters of the river in the region where it is divided by a river. On the Mexican side, they're a super interesting agency because they're the only federal agency that is not headquartered in Mexico City. Mexico is a far more centralized country than the United States, but the IBWC has its headquarters in Ciudad Juarez, and the US IBWC headquarters are in El Paso, fittingly, so they can talk to one another. And basically, that agency continues to be in charge of governing the waters. So you might have heard about, Texas Governor Abbott going and mowing down an island in the middle of the Rio Grande. It's the IBWC that would be the one that would determine, is that actually Texas's island or is it Mexico's? That kind of role. And it's, like the construction of the dam, a binational agency that has two separate offices.
Yeah, no, thank you for detailing that. And it sounds like such a rich and really complex, complex history that really, it dates back, of course, to 1904, but even before then. And it seems that the dam's construction, to me at least, addressed a few needs. So, as you said, and I think detailed, agriculture, the need for water and irrigation, the rapidly expanding agriculture in both South Texas and in northeastern Mexico. I understand there's also hydroelectricity that's produced by the dam, but perhaps flood mitigation not so much. Perhaps not. At least maybe hasn't served that role currently. In your wonderful article, the New York Review of Books, which I highly recommend to all of our listeners, you described the Rio Grande, as you just said, also in this interview, as unruly. And I think that's such an interesting sort of descriptor. And I was wondering, could you just talk a little bit more about what you meant by that? How was the unruliness of the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo a factor in the dam's construction?
Definitely. The Rio Grande is a rather shallow river that historically had a pretty wide floodplain. And so it meandered. It would kind of change course depending on the amount of water and the year and the cycles of the water. And it would meander across this floodplain and in kind of a beautiful way. Like you see, nowadays we have technology like LiDAR that can photograph this movement underground, but you can also see it on the surface. And it's quite beautiful. And one of the effects that had was that the silt, so like the dissolved particles of like really fine soil that the river carries, would be deposited along its banks. And also the water would often kind of drown short plants. So what you had was this kind of like very rich, silty bank that constantly got new soil deposited onto it, and then a very tall canopy that wasn't going to get drowned by the river. And so that right along the river, of course, you had the shorter canopy further away. But that kind of border zone between the river and the land made the area one of these very richly biodiverse areas in the country, also because it's at this kind of subtropical zone where you have the tropical birds and also the more temperate zone birds mixing. And so like this is just a region that's very well known for being biodiverse. However, the changes to the river that have been done since the early 20th century have unfortunately have somewhat negative effects. And the ones that we're seeing now in the 21st century are even more detrimental. But basically, in addition to building the dam, the engineers wanted to kind of control the movement of the river. And so the river was channelized. So now it is a more narrow and deeper river that just deposits its silt in its own channel rather than kind of making these fertile banks.
Thank you for detailing that. So what I'm hearing you say is that the Presa Falcón, that the Falcon Dam, these other dams or several dams along the Rio Grande, that they've really just radically transformed not just the river itself, but also sort of the surrounding vegetation, biodiversity, and our relationship with it.
Yeah, I would say, the way that I learned about this dam, the existence of this dam, was that I met someone who had been born in the town of Salineño, which is just downstream of the Falcon Dam. It was actually one of the towns where they considered building it, but they ended up choosing Falcón. So Salineño, the town, continues to exist. It's still there, but it does, where the river flows through it, the river is channelized. So this person just sort of offhandedly was telling me the story of, when I was a kid, we could just walk across to Mexico, we could go buy meat or whatever. And then after they built the Presa Falcón, we could no longer do that anymore. And I was shocked because I had not ever realized that the management of the Rio Grande was also part of the management of the US-Mexico border. And so that was sort of what put me down this years-long rabbit hole of the history of the Presa Falcón. And that, that particular person had the fortune to not have been displaced. But, as I'll explain, the biggest kind of human impact of this dam was that about 5,000 people lost their homes.
Yeah, no, thank you for just sort of detailing that genesis of the project. Pivoting a little bit, as you know, this podcast series is particularly focused on flood and justice. And while the Falcon Dam seems like it maybe even in theory could have been supporting flood mitigation, and certainly is an attempt to sort of tame this sort of unruly river and sort of its seasonal floods, it actually caused several towns on both sides of the border to be flooded, and as you just said, displaced thousands of people. Could you just walk us through the human cost of the building of the Falcon Dam? How did it impact the local community?
Definitely. I think that really is the key to the story here, and sort of the real impact of building this dam. Basically, as I mentioned, the IBWC was sort of the agency overseeing the construction of the dam. They did inform the communities that were going to be inundated by kind of the bowl of the reservoir that was formed, which was not only the town of Falcón, but a number of smaller towns, and then the largest town of Zapata. So all in all, it's about 5,000 people who at the time were living pretty traditional agrarian lives for the most part. Zapata was the biggest town. It had stores, it had schools, it had a movie theater. And so people were informed by the IBWC, but in interviews and oral histories later, they repeat again and again that many of them felt like the people in the smaller towns weren't sufficiently informed as to what was going to happen. At the same time, as people didn't fully grasp the fact that they needed to move, the IBWC did not prepare them to move in the sense of giving them a new place to live. So everyone whose house on the U.S. side was going to be inundated received from the IBWC a payout of the market value determined by the IBWC minus 40%, 20% for depreciation and 20% for obsolescence, which is to me a bit of a mystery in terms of a calculation, because if something is market value, why would it then have depreciation subtracted from it? Or like, why would the market value is supposed to be the current value? So they were kind of projecting to the future that it was going to become obsolete or that it was going to lose value. I don't really know. But in any case, the IBWC came up with this formula for paying people that was quite sort of unfair in most people's eyes. And on top of that, it was also not only the value of their land and home, but a cultural heritage. In many cases, these were plots of land or homes that had been inherited over multiple generations. There was, a community that was well woven together. And so there were elements of things that were lost that they couldn't really be paid out for. And so on the US side, the IBWC came to be known as I Beat Up Women and Children, because Whoa. People really did not care for the agency. And then finally, the IBWC also didn't want to have to take the responsibility of platting a new town site for the town of Zapata to move all the people that were displaced to. They saw their role simply as buying the land for the dam and paying people out and done. Finally, the legislators from South Texas lobbied Congress enough that the IBWC did plat out a new town site, but it was just, a street grid, a highway, and a couple of municipal buildings. They didn't take the responsibility to build people new houses, and there weren't a ton of carpenters in this area. You can imagine, most people were small farmers. They were not practicing building trades, and this was everyone in the entire community having to move. So even as fast as they tried to move, it was a challenge. On the Mexico side, the story is very different. The Mexican government took it upon themselves to build a new town site of the town of Guerrero, so it's called Nuevo Guerrero, and they made sure that there was housing, municipal buildings, a theater, a plaza, a church, a school, They really wanted to have for the people to have a place to move into, and they used that town as worker housing when the lake hadn't been filled yet. And then once the construction was over, the workers went back to their homes, and the people from Guerrero moved into Nuevo Guerrero. Meanwhile, on the U.S. side, similarly, the workers in general did not have places to live. There was sort of a boom of trailer parks, but it was short-lived because they didn't have water or gas hookups. A lot of people came from the local area, but they still had a lot more labor needs than they had housing for. All this came to a head when the lake filled well ahead of schedule. So about a year ahead of schedule, there was a torrential rain that lasted 6 days, and the IBWC made the decision to open up the reservoir rather than to flood downriver. And that meant that with about 24 hours notice, everyone in Falcón, Zapata, and the other towns had to evacuate. Many people lost everything they owned. Some people, were able to take their belongings, but not their farm animals. Basically, the water just rose very, very fast and destroyed everyone's houses with it. So, I think that sort of traumatic and fast experience of loss also added to this sort of perception of this event of building the Falcon Dam as such a traumatic one, and one that was so kind of imbued with loss. And I think, this isn't the only story of a community that was affected by dam building in the United States. We have dams all over the country, and many of the communities are also other racialized communities. You have Black communities with the Tennessee Valley Authority and other dam building projects in the U.S. South, and then you have Indigenous communities that were affected by dams. And I think, this is another example of that kind of racialized injustice. And the sort of unique piece of it is that you had this community that was very stitched to the U.S.-Mexico borderland. So like the example I gave of the person I met, these people in these communities would cross very freely back and forth. So the town of Zapata had a bridge to Guerrero, and once the Presa Falcón was built, those towns were now 8 miles apart. So you couldn't just go back and forth to do your shopping and see your family or go to school in some cases.
Yeah, thank you so much for detailing all of that, Caroline. And I really appreciate you putting it into a bigger context of sort of across the U.S., how we sort of see this very long history of development, namely of the creation of dams, and who that impacts, and whose communities, whose homes, whose lives are sort of seen as sort of less valuable. So I really, really appreciate that sort of larger context that you gave, in addition to sort of this really highly sort of local context and local case. On the last podcast episode that we did on sort of Brownsville, Matamoros, with Dr. Olivares Gonzalez, we discussed the construction of levees in Brownsville. So this other sort of form of infrastructure along the Rio Grande, along the Texas Tamaulipas border. But in this context, these sort of levees sort of doubled as a continuation of the U.S. border wall. And of course, we know that the wall exacerbates flooding issues in the borderlands. We've got a lot of examples of that from Arizona and also from Texas. I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about the status of the U.S. border wall near the Falcon Dam. I feel after reading the article there was a little bit of a question mark that we weren't actually sure the sort of the current status in Zapata County in that area. If you could just sort of give us a little bit of a status update of what's sort of going on now with the wall in that region.
Yes. Texas was the last state on the U.S.-Mexico border to get a wall, because it is largely because of the legacy of Spanish colonization, all private land. So whereas California, Arizona, and New Mexico are public land a lot of public land in the borderlands, in Texas, the federal government had to do a lot of eminent domain to build a wall. And they knew this was going to be a very challenging and long and costly process. And so they waited. There were appropriations made by Congress under Trump to build the wall through certain portions of Texas. Still not all of it, but in the Rio Grande Valley, so like where those levees are, and then also in Starr and Zapata counties, and into Laredo, which is a city that spans both sides of the border, but still doesn't have a wall, interestingly. So when Biden was elected, he promised that there was going to be no border wall, not one more foot. Then, of course, the levees that you mentioned happened. That was sort of hidden as part of the Army Corps of Engineers work. But then Biden, according to his account, came into the understanding that he actually could not cancel these appropriations that had been made by Congress. He had to use them for what they were designated for. So, according to him, he had no choice but to build border wall through these counties. And so this is something that has been contested by activists on the ground. Scott Nickel, who's someone I quote in the article, who's a border wall activist in the Rio Grande Valley, believes that they could have used this appropriation from Congress for environmental mitigation or repair, or, in our wildest dreams, tearing down the border wall. You could have funneled the money towards something that was related to the border wall, was not actually constructing more border wall. In terms of the actual reservoir itself, there are no plans to build a wall because the reservoir essentially functions as a wall. But in Starr and Zapata counties, it is looking like there is going to be border wall construction. Also, when Biden had said that there was not going to be border wall construction, the state of Texas started trying to build a wall that would essentially run the length that had been canceled. That has mainly been through large payouts to ranchers. The federal government can't pay ranchers more than market value, but the state of Texas could pay whatever they want. I think there are probably a number of tactics the state is using to acquire the right of way through that land, because they're just acquiring the right of way, not the purchasing the land in many cases. And then another interesting case is the town of Salineno, which I mentioned before, that's one town below, has a bird sanctuary that's right on the banks of the river. And they fought a long fight with the federal government to not have a border wall built through their sanctuary. And they've been informed by the federal government that they will not have a border wall. So the government is at the moment respecting some of the sort of previous promises it made, but there's still going to be, in all likelihood, a number of people affected, and among those people are people whose families were already displaced once by the Falcon Dam. So there's this sort of double displacement that's going on in terms of border militarization, where different generations of border militarization are affecting the same people.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for detailing that and giving us all that sort of context and sort of history, and just sort of bringing it sort of to sort of contentious contemporary politics. Pivoting to a sort of a different sort of contemporary issue around sort of water, but not flooding. I understand that the reservoir created by the Falcon Dam is at a record low. And this continues to be the case after Tropical Storm Alberto, which in the last 2 or 3 weeks brought 4 to 5 inches of rain to the region. Still, Falcon Dam remains at record lows. Could you just give some context as to why the reservoir is so low?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Rio Grande is in a similar situation to the Colorado River, although it does not get as much attention. It has about 1/5 of the flow of the Colorado River, but slightly over 1/5 of the amount of people depend on it. I don't think it gets 1/5 of the news coverage. So I do think that there needs to be more attention on what's going on in the Rio Grande. Basically, there's sort of this famous story about the Colorado River where in the years that the amount was apportioned, they were particularly wet years. And so the idea of how much water we have is too high. And something somewhat similar happened in the treaty with the Rio Grande. It wasn't necessarily extremely wet years, but definitely the sort of imagination of how much water there was going to be was pretty optimistic. So the appropriation was very optimistic, but then on top of that, we now have less water in the system due to climate change. And so droughts are more frequent and more intense. And on top of that, there is also more demand, right? There's expansion of irrigation, there's population growth, there's more consumption. So we have a lot of demands on the system right now. and they're going to be very hard to resolve. There's something, that they're going to be very hard to resolve, period, and it's something that we're going to be dealing with in the near and long-term future. Two of the conflicts that are going on right now that are kind of representative. One is over the 1944 treaty. Under that treaty, Mexico owes the United States a certain amount of water every 5 years. And we're coming to the end of a 5-year period right now, and they have not paid that water amount back. This, as you can imagine, has a lot of Texas politicians very worked up, very angry, very eager to blame Mexico. The problem with blaming Mexico in this situation is that the treaty does account for extreme situations. It just doesn't define what an extreme situation is or how you deal with it or anything. So I think this is a conflict where we may see that the US punishes Mexico in some way or tries to punish Mexico in some way because that's sort of the way Texas politics want to deal with this. Or we may see that the IBWC meets with both sides and they work out what is an extreme situation and how do we deal with the fact that these are going to be more frequent. So that's something to watch. Another case to watch is that there has been a lawsuit between Texas and New Mexico about New Mexico's use of the Rio Grande, and really it's about groundwater extraction near Texas's point, take like the point where the Rio Grande gets diverted to Texas. And this is a really interesting case because all over the American West and all over the United States and the world, groundwater and surface water were really kind of kept separate when water laws were written. And groundwater was very poorly understood for a long time. So there's a 1904 Texas Supreme Court case where they say that groundwater is so secret, occult, and concealed that no one can know how it works. And so there are groundwater laws in many states, but there often aren't great either science or policy about how the two connect, groundwater and surface water. And so I think that's going to be something that is just under like constant litigation in the next couple decades.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for sharing and sort of detailing all of that. There's a whole host of changes, it seems, that are going on that you've detailed. Climate change, induced reductions in snowmelt, upriver, sort of interstate politics, a drought in sort of South Texas, lots of agricultural use, not to mention that the region from the Falcon Dam to the Gulf of Mexico is home to approximately 4 million people on both sides of the border. I recently read in the Texas Standard that the Rio Grande Valley Sugar Growers Association is ending sugarcane production after over 51 years in the area. Given these changes, what do you think is the future of water in this particular region?
I was interested to see all that news coverage of the sugar plant closing down and people being very upset about sort of losing sugar as an industry in the region. I think obviously a lot of it has to do with jobs, people's livelihoods. That's very important for sure. But what I had heard about that sugar mill prior to hearing that it was closing down was that it was a site of like numerous environmental violations. I do think that that's, there are environmental impacts of industry. And I think to sort of return to the real point of the question, like we're going to see industry change either by progressive thinking and legislation or out of necessity in the coming decades. So I think we're seeing this in the Colorado River that like states and the federal government both are trying to come up with ways to transition out of alfalfa. Some farmers are getting huge payouts because they have senior water rights and, by sort of legal right, they feel they should get to continue growing alfalfa. But, I think we're sort of at the moment where things are changing in the direction of using less water because these rivers are in crisis. And so I think we're going to start to see the Rio Grande version of that, and we're going to have to decide like what are the things that we want to prioritize. Do we want to prioritize irrigation for commercial crops? Do we want to prioritize urban uses, or do we want to prioritize ecosystem services?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Caroline, for being with the podcast with me today. This has been wonderful, and just really phenomenal to sort of hear more about your work. And just thank you so much.
Thank you.